And welcome back, everyone. So, Luke, before the break, we were talking with Dr. Zetland about water and property rights. Would you you had a specific question you wanted to discuss on that point.
Yeah, David, I wanted to get you to comment on this. Would you be able to explain to us what the tragedy of the commons is and why property rights are so important, especially when it comes to water?
Simple. Simple. What I just said. Wrong question. Wrong answer. Simple, not so simple. So the tragedy of the commons refers to what happens when you have what's called a common pool resource. And the original example was a grass field where anybody could add their sheep to the field so that each individual was getting a benefit from the sheep. But when you started adding more and more and more sheep to the commons, that ground, a limited amount of ground, there were too many sheep after a while, and the sheep ended up destroying the commons. So the tragedy was that each individual choosing an action that's rational from their own perspective would choose to put a sheep on there, but as a group, too many sheep would come to the commons until it was destroyed and everybody was worse off. It's a very good example to use for water, and it's typically used with what's identified by economists as a common pool resource, and that is basically something like a pool of water or an underground aquifer. And what that means in terms of the tragedy of the commons is that you might have, one or two or 50, not one, you might have 2 or 10 or 50 or 500 different farmers, for example, who are all drawing water out of that aquifer, and each of them is deciding to take as much water as makes sense to himself, but all of them collectively are draining that aquifer so that there's not going to be as much water tomorrow as they want. Now, there's 2 different ways, really, to solve this problem, and they both involve a kind of a privatization. So the economic jargon for a common pool resource is that it's non-excludable, and that means it's everybody is able to get in there and get their straw in and pull water out. So in order to limit that destruction of the aquifer, you need to be able to exclude people. And essentially that means you either assign private shares in the aquifer so that each individual is not allowed to take more than that portion so that the other portions are protected and there's no race to the bottom. That's the word that they use, the expression. Or you can actually set up a kind of a club which has less formal property rights but has informal property rights so that members of the club are allowed to stay in the club as long as they follow the rules of the club. And those might be very informal, called you took some today, I'll take some tomorrow, but they can also be quite robust. And this is important. It's important to keep track of these, or not keep track of. It's important to note that both of these methods can work. And the first method of essentially privatization is associated with the economist Ronald Coase, who won the Nobel Prize for his observations on things like privatizing this commons. And the second method is associated with Lynn Ostrom, who just recently won the Nobel Prize for her work on, she's a political scientist, for her work on institutions for managing common pool resources. And ironically, she did her PhD work on groundwater in Southern California. So the point is that when you have a common pool resource, if you don't manage it wisely through one of these methods of exclusion, then it will be overexploited and destroyed so that it's not going to benefit anybody in the future.
Now, the government of Chile allowed farmers and companies to own water in the 1980s, and what were the effects of that?
I'm vaguely familiar with the Chilean example, and my impression, and I've not read anything to contradict it, is that the creation of property rights in water has led to a very robust market for water, so that farmers and businesses and as well as municipalities are trading water back and forth. And what that has done is tightened up very much the distribution of water so that it tends to go to the highest value uses. That means usually cities, it means industry that is producing high value with the water, and it means agriculture. that's producing high value. And that is one of the big drivers behind the shift in Chilean agriculture from what you would call low-value crops to high-value export crops, such as fruit and wine, which we get a lot of in our markets in North America.
Right. Yeah, and actually, Sigerfeld quotes that back in the 70s, the conditions for water in Chile were terrible. They were 27% of Chileans in rural areas, and 63% of urban communities had steady access to safe, clean water. And by the early 2000s, that figure was 94 and 99% respectively. And,
right. This can be traced to two things. One is that the quantification of water volumes and water rights and the assignment of water rights meant that everybody was very interested in making sure that water was not only not wasted but also not stolen, so that if you had a water right, you were going to make sure that your neighbors weren't taking more than their water rights would allow. So that was very important. The other thing that was important is that when these markets came along, they allowed not just trading but created signals of value. And that meant that cities and other places that wanted to buy water could indicate they wanted to just by offering a price. And farmers had a good idea about how much their water was worth using it for agriculture compared to selling it to cities. So unlike the situation in places like the United States, cities in Chile had a much easier access to water for urban use. In the U.S., where there are very, very few water markets, you will have cities going begging for water that cannot get it because markets do not exist and do not know how much it costs because there are no market prices for water.
Go ahead,
There's a difference, though, isn't there, David, between privatization and market prices? So the government may get private companies to develop water infrastructure, but that doesn't then mean that they can still they still then may force them to only charge a certain price.
Sure, the government can regulate prices wherever they want to. The question is, when do they want to? Is that going to be efficient or helpful? So, as I mentioned earlier in the show, almost around the world it's universally true that water is held in trust by the government. The government is assigning water rights or giving them to people that are now trading the water rights. So that structure is going to be intact. And then the trading of the water or water rights is going to depend usually on governments allowing that trade to occur. And then the prices that emerge are either going to be free market prices or they're going to be prices that are affected by government regulations.